All right, these next few pictures of models and microscope slides are going to be based on the endocrine system and also the blood. So for starters, here's some microscope slides, and I'm going to go through what these are and what you need to know about them. So these are related to the endocrine system. This is, I'll start with this one. This is obviously the pituitary gland because it says it. This is the anterior, this is the posterior. So I know it's kind of hard to tell the difference here, but the posterior, remember, has a lot of neurons in it, so it's going to look more like nervous tissue. The anterior is going to have more blood vessels, so it's going to look a little bit different and ideally look like blood vessels. Which brings me to this picture. I like this one a little bit better, but you can clearly see this side is different than this side. So this is the side that has all the blood vessels, which are different colors, and so mainly the red here. So this is the anterior pituitary. This is the posterior pituitary. Coming over here, this is actually the pineal gland. Remember, the pineal gland secretes melatonin. So one of the key characteristics of it is you get these little areas in the pineal gland that kind of look granular. And so it's like a little darker pinkish color, reddish color. And this is called pineal sand. And it is the big way to identify the pineal gland. So pineal gland with pineal sand, these little granules. Here's a microscope slide of the thyroid gland, and there's a few things to discuss here. So these circles, like you see here, here's a big one here, and here, these are the follicles, and they're made up of these cells called follicular cells. The cells in between the follicles, remember, are called parafollicular cells, and they release a different hormone. But the follicular cells are the ones that secrete the T3 and T4. And the stuff that they're secreting that's in the middle of it, that's called colloid. And so one question that we have asked in the past is, if you can see stuff in here, that means it is actively secreting. If you don't see anything in the follicle, then it's not actively secreting. So here's the pancreas. So two different views of the pancreas. Here's kind of a zoomed out view. So remember, the pancreas has these little areas called islets of Langerhans. So here's one, here's another. And then the rest of this is mainly called acini. And so the acini have the digestive function that we'll talk about later. But what we're worried about right now are the islets of Langerhans. That's where we have the alpha and beta cells that secrete insulin and glucagon. And this is just zoomed in on one islet of Langerhans. And so the acini would be all this stuff out here. Here's a model that we have in the lab of the endocrine system based on a baby. So I'll just run through some things even though they're labeled. So the pineal body, pineal gland is here. Remember, that secretes melatonin. Here's your pituitary hanging off the brain. Anterior, posterior. We talked about all the hormones that are secreted. Here's your thyroid gland in the neck region. Secretes T3 and T4 along with calcitonin. And then parathyroids are in the back. They secrete parathyroid hormone. The thymus is on the front of the heart, and in the adult is usually not this big. In a child or a baby, it's usually a little bit bigger like this, and it's important in T lymphocyte development, which we'll get more into T lymphocytes later. Then from the front view, you see the pancreas right here, the testes, which secrete testosterone, and then on top of the kidneys, you have the adrenal glands. You remember, the adrenal gland has the cortex and medulla that secrete different hormones. And then finishing up the major microscope slide. So this is a microscope slide of the ovary. And these kind of areas in here that look like they're fluid filled, these are the follicles. So we'll talk more about this with the reproductive system, but these are the follicles within the ovary. So every month the follicles develop due to follicle stimulating hormone, and you end up with a mature follicle. This is actually a really big one. But a big follicle kind of like this would be called a Graafian follicle. We'll get into more of that later. And that there's an egg inside of it, and that's going to be released during ovulation. And this is a slide of the testes. So in the testes, you get all these little circles. These are actually little tubes called seminiferous tubules. So we will discuss this with the male reproductive system. And this, zooming in on this, these are the seminiferous tubules, and you see the different types of cells. Don't worry about the cell types yet. We'll get to that with the reproductive system. So just kind of know what they look like. So be able to identify this as the testes, this is the ovary. And lastly, I just have with the endocrine system, I wanted to talk a little bit about, we talked about disorders in the lecture, but here's a model we have in the lab of how the disease diabetes mellitus affects the body. So remember, diabetes mellitus is you have impairments in insulin production. Either you're not producing enough, or you're insulin resistant, so it's not doing its job. And so diabetes mellitus, when you get this elevated glucose for extended periods of time due to poor insulin regulation, you end up with a lot of damage all over the body. So it can affect the brain. So you get lesions in the brain from this as a neural component. Damage to the eye, you can get something called retinopathy when you get damage to the blood vessels in the eye. Lots of damage to the cardiovascular system, so you're seeing plaque buildup in the blood vessels. As far as the kidneys go, you can get a lot of damage to the kidneys, because remember, the kidneys, well, we haven't really talked about it yet, but the kidneys are really important at filtering the blood, and diabetes can start scarring the kidneys a little bit, so they're not as functional. And diabetes is actually one of the big causes of kidney failure. And so pancreas, that's where it all begins, with the insulin production or lack thereof in type 1 diabetes, or insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes. Then we get what's called neuropathy, so damage to neurons, and that affects the entire nervous system. And a lot of times you get damage to the extremities, namely the feet. So due to you may get an injury on the foot but not feel it due to the nerve damage, and so it just gets worse and worse over time. So one of the things you commonly hear about diabetics is that they should constantly be kind of looking at their feet and making sure they don't have any issues going on, because they may not feel it if they do. The last thing I'm going to say about the endocrine system is I just want you to watch this video. It's a link to a YouTube video. I'll put this link on Canvas also, but it's a little experiment they do with a fish, kind of showing the importance of insulin and what happens if insulin gets it's too much and causes a reduction in blood glucose. So watch that at your convenience, and I'll post this link on Canvas also. So shifting gears a little bit to the blood, I'm just going to run through some microscope slides. You saw a lot of these in the lecture, but these little specks in the background are platelets where the arrows are going. All these pinkish cells with the kind of opening in the middle, even though it's not a true opening, those are the erythrocytes, the red blood cells that carry oxygen. And here's a leukocyte that you may recognize. This is a lymphocyte. Remember, lymphocytes look smooth. Nucleus takes up most of the cell. So coming over here, this is actually a slide of bone marrow. And in the bone marrow, you have these megakaryocytes, and that comes into play here because megakaryocytes, they fall apart, they fragment to form platelets. So this is a microscope slide of a megakaryocyte that's eventually going to fragment and form platelets. So these are all our leukocytes that I wanted to just review. So here, the lymphocyte. These two multilobe nuclei would be neutrophils. Coming over here, this one with the reddish/orange color would be an eosinophil. Here's another eosinophil. Notice the different color. And here's a basophil. So basophil, it's kind of large, big granules, kind of look spiky in appearance. And the last thing I'm going to do is just review blood typing really quick. And so this is what I was trying to do in the lecture, showing you like you basically have 3 drops of blood, and you put antibody A on one drop, antibody B on another, antibody D or RH on the other. Same thing over here. So let's see what happens and see if we can go through and determine what blood type it is. So on antibody A, you get agglutination, nothing on B, agglutination on RH. So that means there's a positive reaction for the antigen. It means the antigen A is present there. It means the Rh antigen is present also. What we don't see is that the B antigen is not present because this one didn't do anything. So this would be A positive. Using a similar analogy, we can do this. So nothing here. Yes, yes. So B positive. Come in here. Yes, yes, yes. So this would be AB positive. This would be no, no, no. So this would be O, because there's no antigens there. Negative, because there's no Rh antigen. Coming over here, this would be O positive. This would be AB negative. This one would be B negative. And lastly, A negative. And so after you listen to the lecture on the blood typing, see if you can get the same answers here as I did.